My boyfriend told me his cousin's wedding was family only, no plus ones allowed, and he said it so casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world, like it wasn't something that would sit in my chest and slowly twist all night. And I remember forcing a smile because I didn't want to be the difficult girlfriend, the insecure one, the one who makes everything a problem. So I told myself it was fine, that families are weird, that traditions exist. That trust means accepting answers even when they hurt a little. I trusted him. I trusted him enough to help him pick his suit, enough to steam his shirt, enough to joke about how bored he'd be without me there, enough to kiss him goodbye without checking his phone, without asking more questions, without listening to that quiet voice in my head that was already uncomfortable. While he was gone, I tried to distract myself, scrolling, cleaning, answering messages, pretending I didn't feel left out, pretending I didn't feel strangely erased, like I existed only when it was convenient. And then, without looking for it, without suspecting anything, I saw it. A wedding photo. Not sent to me. Not mentioned by him. Just there. The image stopped my breath before my mind could catch up. He was standing in the center of the frame, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, relaxed, confident, familiar, his arm wrapped around a blonde woman whose body leaned into his like she belonged there, like this wasn't new, like this wasn't awkward, like this was normal. They weren't posing. They were comfortable. In another photo, they were slow dancing, his head tilted toward hers, his mouth close to her ear, her hand gripping the back of his neck, his suit jacket draped over her shoulders like it was instinct, like it was something he'd done before without thinking. Then I saw the caption. Most beautiful couple at our wedding. I stared at those words longer than I should have, rereading them, waiting for my brain to correct what my eyes were seeing, waiting for context that never came. And the comments. That's when something inside me cracked. His mother had commented first. Finally, a daughter-in-law I can be proud of. I felt cold all over. Not angry. Not hysterical. Just hollow. I clicked on the woman's profile with hands that didn't feel like mine anymore, and suddenly everything I had ignored, excused, or explained away began lining up perfectly, like pieces that had always been there, just waiting for me to stop defending him. Photos of candlelit dinners on nights he told me he was exhausted. Smiling selfies during trips he called work obligations. An elegant restaurant post dated on my birthday, the same night he claimed he couldn't even sit up because of food poisoning. Every lie had a timestamp. Every excuse had a location. By the time he came home, I already knew more than he realized, but I didn't say a word, because something had shifted inside me, something calm and terrifying, something that didn't need answers anymore. He showed me photos from the wedding, carefully chosen ones, cropped just right, safe angles, friendly group shots, and watched my face closely as he talked, waiting for suspicion, waiting for cracks, waiting for me to fall apart. I smiled. I nodded. I told him it looked nice. And in that moment, he thought he was still in control. He had no idea that I had already stepped out of the version of myself that believed him. I didn't confront him, not because I was weak, not because I was confused, but because something inside me clicked into a calm I didn't recognize, the kind of quiet that only comes when your heart stops asking questions and starts collecting facts. So I kept my face soft and my voice normal while my chest burned, and I watched him closely, watched how easily he slipped back into our space, how he dropped his keys like nothing had happened, how he kissed my cheek with the same mouth that had. Whispered into another woman's ear under fairy lights and family laughter, and that was when I understood this wasn't just cheating, it was a performance he had rehearsed. He talked casually about the wedding without ever mentioning her, mentioned speeches and food and music like he was recapping a work meeting, carefully avoiding details, carefully avoiding eye contact, carefully controlling the story. And when he finally showed me the photos on his phone, they were cropped so tight they looked innocent. Just him standing alone, him laughing with relatives, him holding a drink, no blonde hair, no hand on his arm, no jacket missing from his shoulders, and I smiled. At the right moments, nodded at the right places, acted impressed, acted trusting, acted like the girl who still believed him. Inside, I was already somewhere else. I found her account that same night, not because he slipped up but because men like him always underestimate how connected their lies are, how many threads they leave behind. And there she was, public profile, glowing smile, captions full of hearts and inside jokes. Photos that filled in every blank he'd carefully erased, his jacket wrapped around her shoulders like a claim, his hand on her lower back in reflections he never noticed, comments from people I recognized, people who knew my name. People who had smiled at me across tables and couches, and that realization hit harder than the cheating itself. This wasn't a secret between two people. It was a shared joke I was never invited into. Scrolling felt like falling, each post confirming what my body already knew. Dinners he'd blamed on late meetings, trips he'd labeled as exhausting, dates that lined up perfectly with nights I'd eaten alone and defended him to friends. And I didn't cry, not yet. Because anger hadn't finished forming, because something sharper was taking its place, something patient. When he came to bed, he slept easily, confidently, like a man who believed his version of reality had won, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every cropped photo, every lie told with a straight face, Every time his mother's voice echoed in my head from that comment under the wedding post, and that's when I stopped seeing this as a betrayal and started seeing it as a mistake they all made together. They thought I was oblivious. They thought silence meant ignorance. They thought smiling meant forgiving. What they didn't realize was that I had stopped reacting, and once a woman does that, she's no longer inside your story. She's writing her own, quietly, carefully, while you keep talking, unaware that every word you say is only making the ending sharper. I stayed exactly the same on the surface, because changing would have warned him, and I needed him comfortable, careless, still believing he was the smartest person in the room, so I laughed at his jokes, answered his texts fast enough, but slow enough to feel distant, cooked dinners we barely talked over, listened to him complain about work trips that I now knew were anything but work, and every lie he told slid into place like evidence being filed, not emotions being processed. What surprised me most wasn't how well he lied, it was how easily everyone else helped him do it. Our names I recognized kept appearing under the photos, how his cousin replied with heart emojis, how his mother liked every post where she stood next to him wearing his jacket like a badge, and how no one seemed uncomfortable pretending I didn't exist, as if erasing me was easier than admitting we participated. And that was when the humiliation stopped hurting and started clarifying. I began paying attention to patterns instead of excuses, to dates instead of apologies, to tone instead of words, and suddenly the relationship made sense in a way it never had before. Distance to defensiveness. The way he accused me of overthinking whenever I got close to the truth, because men who are hiding something don't fear questions, they fear timing, and he thought he controlled that. I didn't block her, didn't message her, didn't even react, because I wanted her company too, posting freely, tagging locations, resharing stories that accidentally lined up with moments he swore he was somewhere else. And every screenshot felt less like proof and more like insurance, not for revenge, not yet, but for control, because I was done being the only one without him. And we talked about the future, about trips we'd take, plans we'd make, changes we'd discuss. I realized he wasn't confused, he was greedy, wanting two realities to run in parallel without ever colliding, and I let him believe he was succeeding. Because the more comfortable he became, the sloppier he got, and comfort makes people careless in ways anger never does. There was a moment, brief but sharp, when he almost slipped, when he mentioned a place he'd never told me about, a restaurant I'd seen tagged under her photo, and he froze just long enough to notice my pause, and I smiled. Asked a follow-up question in the most innocent tone I could manage, and watched relief flood his face when I didn't push, and that was the moment I knew this wasn't going to end in a fight. It was going to end in exposure. Not loud, not chaotic, not emotional, but precise, because I wasn't interested in screaming or crying or begging for explanations that would never be honest anyway. I was interested in timing and alignment, in letting him feel safe enough to believe he'd won, while I quietly rearranged my place in his life from center to exit, and the calm that settled over me then wasn't sadness, it was clarity. The kind that comes right before someone realizes the story they've been telling isn't the one that's about to be heard. I didn't rush anything after that, because rushing is what people do when they still want answers, and I already had mine. So instead I started moving quietly through his life the same way he'd been moving through mine, carefully, observantly. Noticing how much of our relationship depended on my silence, my flexibility, my willingness to believe him over myself, and once I saw that clearly it became almost frightening how easy it was to step back without him noticing. I stopped covering for him in small ways first, stopped answering texts for him when his phone buzzed during dinner, stopped reminding him of family events, stopped smoothing over awkward moments with his friends who suddenly felt less friendly now that I recognized the guilt behind their smiles, and none of them said anything, not because they didn't notice, but because people who benefit from a lie rarely challenge it. They just hope you stay quiet long enough to make it permanent. He sensed the shift without understanding it, started asking if I was okay more often, started touching my arm when we talked like he was trying to ground me back into place, and I played my role perfectly, reassuring him with soft answers and tired smiles. Letting him believe I was simply drifting, not detaching, because men like him don't panic when you pull away emotionally. They panic when you pull away strategically, and he had no idea which one I was doing. The first rail crack appeared when I declined an invitation he assumed I'd attend without question, a family dinner where I knew she would be there, not officially introduced, but openly accepted. And when I said I had other plans, his confusion flickered into irritation before he masked it, asking too many questions too quickly, and I answered them calmly, vaguely, watching him struggle with the unfamiliar feeling of not having full access to my time. Later that night, while he slept, I transferred copies of everything I'd gathered into places he would never think to look, timestamps aligned, screenshots labeled, patterns documented, not to use immediately but to have ready. Because power doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from preparation, and I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in ending the illusion cleanly. What he didn't realize was that while he was busy maintaining one lie, I was dismantling the structure that made it possible, quietly untangling our lives, emotionally first, then practically. Creating distance that felt invisible to him, but solid to me, and when he finally noticed something was wrong, really wrong, it wasn't because I accused him, it was because I stopped needing him to explain himself at all. That was the moment he started losing control of the narrative, not because I said anything, but because I no longer reacted the way his story required, and people who build their confidence on deception don't know what to do when the audience stops responding. They just keep performing louder, unaware that the silence in front of them isn't confusion anymore, it's the sound of someone already walking away with the ending. The tension didn't explode all at once, it thickened, settling into the space between us like air before a storm, and I could feel him trying to pull me back into alignment, testing old tactics, small jokes meant to disarm me. Sudden affection meant to confuse me, casual future talk meant to anchor me, and each time I responded just enough to keep him steady while internally moving further away, because detachment isn't loud, it's quiet. And quiet unnerves people who rely on chaos to stay in control. He started slipping in ways he never had before, repeating stories he'd already told me with slightly different details, mixing up timelines, referencing conversations we never had, and every mistake confirmed what I already knew. That his confidence had been built on my trust, and now that trust was gone. The structure was wobbling, even if he couldn't see the cracks yet, and I watched him struggle to compensate, working harder to seem normal, to seem attentive, to seem present. One evening, he mentioned her name without realizing it, just once, casually, mid-sentence, like it belonged there, and the silence that followed stretched longer than either of us expected, his face tightening as he waited for my reaction, and I gave him none. Just raised an eyebrow and asked him to repeat what he'd said, calmly, neutrally, and the way he froze told me everything, because fear doesn't come from being caught, it comes from realizing the person you're lying to is no longer confused. He backtracked clumsily, laughed too fast, blamed stress, blamed work, blamed exhaustion, and I let him talk himself in circles while I watched the panic bloom behind his eyes, because this was the first time he understood that I wasn't unaware anymore. I was choosing not to engage, and that realization shifted the balance between us in a way he couldn't undo. From that point on, he started reaching out more aggressively, texting constantly when we weren't together, asking where I was, who I was with, when I'd be home, and the irony wasn't lost on me. How quickly a man who values his privacy panics when he no longer has access to yours, and I answered just enough to keep him guessing, not disappearing, not reassuring, existing just outside his control. He tried to provoke a reaction next, picking small arguments, questioning my tone, accusing me of being distant, hoping I'd explode, hoping I'd cry, hoping I'd finally give him something emotional to work with, but I stayed calm, stayed measured. Stayed unreadable, and nothing unsettles a manipulator faster than realizing the buttons they installed no longer work. By then, I wasn't waiting for the right moment to confront him, I was waiting for the moment he would expose himself without me having to say a word, because lies collapse under their own weight when the person they're meant to fool stops carrying them. And every move he made after that only tightened the space around him, even though he still believed, somehow, that he could talk his way out when the time came, unaware that the ending had already shifted out of his hands and into mine. The unraveling didn't come with a confession or a dramatic slip, it came through desperation, subtle at first, then unmistakable, the kind that makes people act out of character without realizing how transparent they've become. And I watched it happen in real time as his confidence turned brittle and his charm sharpened into something frantic, because the moment he sensed he was losing his grip on the version of me he'd controlled for so long, he started trying to rewrite the story faster than it could keep up with him. He began asking questions that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with fear, wanting to know why I seemed so calm lately, why I wasn't upset when he stayed out late, why I didn't react when he canceled plans last minute. And each question was really a plea for reassurance that I was still the same woman who would fight for explanations, who would argue, who would cry, who would stay engaged long enough for him to keep steering the narrative, and I denied him all of it by staying steady, present, and just out of reach. Then the call started when I wasn't around, not angry, not accusatory, just frequent, excessive, like he needed to hear my voice to remind himself I was still there, and I answered when it suited me, kept my tone neutral, offered no emotional cues, no hooks, no reactions, and the more detached I became, the louder his need grew, because nothing terrifies a liar more than realizing the person they've been lying to no longer needs the truth from them. At some point he tried guilt, reminding me of everything we'd been through. All the good times, all the sacrifices he claimed to have made, reframing the past like a shared debt I owed him, and I listened without interrupting, letting him talk until he ran out of words, then responded with a simple acknowledgement that didn't invite debate, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. That was when the messages escalated, long paragraphs sent late at night, apologies that never named what he was apologizing for, promises to do better without admitting what he'd done wrong. Sudden declarations of love meant to reset everything back to zero, and I read them without urgency, without replying right away, because urgency had always been his weapon, and I wasn't going to hand it back to him now. He didn't know that by then I'd already removed myself from the center of his life emotionally, that I was watching him from a distance he couldn't cross, seeing clearly how much of his control depended on my reaction, my doubt, my willingness to stay engaged. And once that disappeared, all he had left was noise, and noise only works when someone is listening. By the time he realized that something irreversible had shifted, that the calm he kept asking about wasn't temporary, wasn't a phase, wasn't something he could talk his way through, his messages had turned frantic, his calls stacked on top of each other. His voice cracking in ways I'd never heard before, and even then, even with everything laid bare, he still didn't understand the truth, that this wasn't punishment, it wasn't revenge, it was simply the consequence of losing access to someone who had finally stopped carrying his lies for him. The end didn't arrive the way he imagined it would, not with a confrontation he could twist, not with tears he could weaponize, not with a conversation he could later rewrite to make himself the victim, because by the time he realized I was done, I had already stepped out of the role he needed me to play, and without that role, his entire story collapsed in on itself. He left me voicemails that didn't sound like the man I once knew, his voice breaking, rising, dropping into panic, asking me to please just talk to him, to explain what was happening, to tell him what he could fix. Still believing this was a misunderstanding he could manage if he said the right words in the right order, and I listened to every message once, calmly, not to respond, but to confirm what I already knew, that he wasn't sorry for what he did. He was terrified of losing control over how it ended. I didn't announce anything, didn't expose him publicly, didn't send screenshots or tag names or burn bridges for the sake of spectacle, because closure doesn't come from noise, it comes from certainty, and I already had mine, so I simply removed myself. Stopped showing up, stopped answering, stopped participating in a version of my life that had been quietly rewritten behind my back, and the silence that followed was louder than any accusation I could have made. What reached me afterward came through fragments, mutual friends suddenly awkward, family members distant, explanations offered where none were asked for, his story shifting depending on who he was speaking to, because when lies lose their anchor, they start drifting, contradicting themselves, collapsing under their own weight, and I didn't need to correct any of it, because the truth has a way of surfacing on its own when you stop protecting the people who buried it. The last message I ever opened wasn't angry or dramatic, it was small, almost pathetic, a simple question asking if I'd ever really loved him, and I realized then how much he still didn't understand, that love isn't proven by how much you endure. It's proven by how much honesty you're willing to give, and he had offered me none while expecting everything in return. I didn't reply. Not because I was bitter, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I had finally learned the difference between ending something and escaping it, and I wasn't running anymore. I was choosing myself, choosing clarity over chaos. Choosing a future where my silence wasn't confusion or weakness, but the final line in a story I no longer needed to explain to anyone but myself.